Top 1. The Mohenjo-Daro Glass City. In 1922, an Indian archaeologist named R.D. Banerjee discovered something beneath the dusty plains of Sindh, Pakistan, that was never supposed to exist. Buried under centuries of sediment lay the remains of a city older than Babylon and older than Egypt's Great Pyramids. Mohenjo-Daro, which means Mound of the Dead, was once home to over 40,000 people and served as a thriving center of the Indus Valley civilization, complete with advanced drainage systems, granaries, and public baths. However, it was not the city's sophistication that disturbed researchers. It was the way it died. At the city's center, excavation teams found entire blocks of mud brick structures fused into a glossy glass-like mass. Walls that once stood upright had melted and re-solidified into warped, bubbling sheets. Laboratory analysis later estimated the heat required to cause this transformation at roughly 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature no kiln, forge, or fire pit of the Bronze Age could achieve. The melting was not uniform. It radiated outward from a central point in the city, growing weaker with distance and forming a near-perfect gradient of thermal destruction. Scattered across the ancient streets lay 44 human skeletons. They were not buried or arranged. Many were found face down with arms outstretched, some still clutching one another as though frozen in the act of fleeing. No weapons were found among them, no arrowheads, no blade marks on bone, and no signs of organized combat. Whatever killed these people came without warning and left no enemy behind. In 1979, British Indian researcher David Davenport published a detailed analysis of the site alongside Italian journalist Ettore Vincenti. Their findings were controversial but precise. The pattern of destruction, they argued, matched the thermal footprint of a modern airburst detonation. A 50-yard radius at the epicenter showed complete vitrification. Beyond that, bricks were partially fused, and further still, structures showed only heat discoloration. The gradient was consistent, measurable, and unmistakable. Davenport estimated the blast was equivalent to roughly 15 kilotons, the same yield as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Indian authorities never permitted full-scale radiological testing at the site. Access to the epicenter has been restricted for decades under preservation orders, and several key samples collected during early excavations have since disappeared from institutional archives. Independent researchers who attempted to revisit Davenport's findings in the 1990s reported that critical sections of the excavation had been backfilled without explanation. The Mahabharata, one of India's oldest sacred texts, describes a weapon called the Brahmastra, a single projectile charged with the power of the universe. It speaks of a blast brighter than 10,000 suns, of hair and nails falling from the bodies of survivors, and of food becoming poison for weeks after the detonation. For centuries, scholars dismissed these passages as mythology. Then Mohenjo-Daro was unearthed, and the mythology stopped reading like fiction. No volcanic activity has ever been recorded in the Sindh region. No natural phenomenon known to modern science produces a radial vitrification pattern in mud brick. The heat source that turned this city to glass came, struck, and vanished, leaving behind only silence and 44 bodies that no one ever came back to bury. Top 2. The Libyan Desert Glass. In December 1932, British surveyor Patrick Clayton was driving across the Great Sand Sea near the Egyptian-Libyan border when he heard a strange crunching beneath his wheels. He stopped, stepped out, and found the desert floor littered with chunks of pale yellow-green glass, some the size of a fist and others no larger than a pebble. They were scattered across hundreds of square miles of open sand, with no city, no ruin, and no volcanic crater anywhere in sight. The glass was beautiful, almost gem-like, and it had no business being there. Laboratory analysis revealed the material to be nearly 99% pure silica, fused at temperatures exceeding 3,300 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, the surface of Venus is cooler, and the hottest lava on Earth barely reaches 2,200 degrees. Whatever created this glass did not simply melt sand. It vaporized it, then allowed the molten silica to cool into solid sheets scattered across an area of roughly 2,500 square miles. The formation has since been dated to approximately 29 million years ago, but the event that produced it left behind no crater, no impact scar, and no geological signature that any conventional model can fully explain. The glass was not unknown to the ancient world. In 1997, Italian mineralogist Vincenzo de Michele identified a carved scarab at the center of a gold pectoral recovered from the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. The scarab, long assumed to be chalcedony, was in fact Libyan desert glass, shaped and polished by Egyptian artisans over 3,300 years ago. The ancient Egyptians called the material the Rock of God. They did not carve it casually. It sat at the center of a funerary ornament representing the sun deity, placed directly over the heart of a dead king. For decades, the leading hypothesis pointed to a meteoric airburst, an object exploding miles above the surface with enough radiant energy to fuse the sand below without leaving an impact crater. The theory drew support from a widely cited 2006 study by Sandia National Laboratories, which modeled how atmospheric detonations could produce ground-level glass formations. The comparison was difficult to ignore. When Albion W. Hart, one of the first graduates of MIT, visited the Trinity nuclear test site in New Mexico, he noted that the glass left behind by the atomic blast was virtually identical to samples he had seen in the African desert 50 years earlier. The military named that nuclear glass trinitite, and its chemical signature mirrors Libyan desert glass almost exactly. Then in 2023, researchers using transmission electron microscopy found something that rewrote the debate entirely. Embedded within the glass were nanostructures of a mineral called rhyodite, a substance that forms only under pressures exceeding 130,000 atmospheres. Rhyodite does not form in airbursts. It requires a direct physical impact. Yet there is still no confirmed crater anywhere beneath the sand. The Egyptian government has since classified Libyan desert glass as a protected cultural resource. Export is banned and collection is restricted. The region where Clayton first heard that strange crunching under his tires is now largely off limits. Somewhere beneath the dunes lies the answer to what turned 2,500 square miles of desert into glass. And for reasons no one has explained, no one is allowed to go looking. Top 3. The Scottish Fortress Glass. In 1777, geologist John Williams published the first description of something that should not have existed in the Scottish Highlands. Perched on a remote hilltop in Aberdeenshire, the ancient fort of Taponoth had walls made of stone that had been melted into glass. It was not cracked by fire or blackened by smoke. It was melted and fused into a continuous, vitreous mass, as though the entire structure had been subjected to temperatures found only inside an active volcano. There was no volcano anywhere near the site. Over the next 2 centuries, surveyors identified more than 70 similar forts across Scotland alone, with an additional 130 scattered throughout France, Germany, Sweden, Hungary, and Ireland. Each one displayed the same phenomenon. Stone walls, some over 12 feet high and several feet thick, had been heated to between 1,600 and 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit until the rock itself liquefied and resolidified into a glassy shell. In many cases, the vitrification was not partial. Entire wall sections had fused into a single continuous mass, binding individual stones into a structure no mortar could replicate. At Dunderdale and Glen Nevis, the glassy ramparts still gleam in the rain, 25 centuries after they were formed. The question was immediate and has never been fully answered. How did Iron Age people, working with timber, stone, and animal hide, generate and sustain temperatures that modern industrial furnaces struggle to maintain? And more importantly, why? Experiments began in the 1930s when archaeologists Vere Gordon Child and Wallace Thornycroft built a replica stone wall laced with timber and set it ablaze. After 3 hours of sustained burning, the wall collapsed. A few stones showed partial melting, but the result fell far short of the uniform, deep vitrification found across dozens of Scottish sites. A 1978 study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science confirmed that ordinary timber fires, even prolonged ones, could not account for the degree of fusion observed. The temperatures were too high, the duration too long, and the coverage too even. In 2018, a team from the University of Stirling proposed a new theory. They suggested that timber superstructures built atop the stone walls had been deliberately set on fire, and as the flames burned downward into the wall cavity, anaerobic conditions developed. Without oxygen, The fire intensified rather than dying out, reaching temperatures sufficient to melt the stone from within. The theory was elegant and explained the mechanism, but it did not explain the motive. Why would a community spend months constructing a massive defensive wall only to destroy it with fire? Warfare, ritual closure, and ceremonial display were all proposed, but none were proven. Arthur C. Clarke, after visiting Tapo Noth for his television series Mysterious World in 1980, called the vitrified forts the greatest mystery he had ever encountered. He noted that reproducing the effect at scale would require something resembling a directed energy weapon. The comment was dismissed as dramatic, but no one offered a better explanation. 70 forts across one country and 200 across a continent all bear the signature of a heat source that Bronze and Iron Age civilizations had no known means of producing. The stones were melted, the method was lost, and the reason was buried with whoever lit the fire. Top 4. The Tiahuanaco Melt Line. At 12,600 feet above sea level, on the barren altiplano of western Bolivia, stands a ruin that predates the Inca by nearly 1,000 years. Tiahuanaco, also spelled Tiwanaku, was once the ceremonial heart of a civilization that controlled much of the central Andes between 500 and 1000 CE. At its peak, the city housed an estimated 30,000 people and featured monumental architecture carved from stones quarried over 50 miles away. But the feature that has haunted geologists and engineers for over a century is not the scale of the construction, it is the damage. The Gateway of the Sun, Tiahuanaco's most iconic structure, is a single block of andesite weighing approximately 10 tons, carved with intricate reliefs depicting a central figure, flanked by rows of winged attendants. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but across its surface and along the surfaces of surrounding megalithic blocks, researchers have documented a pattern of localized melting that follows perfectly straight lines. The melt marks do not wander or splash. They trace deliberate, linear paths across the stone as though something cut through the rock with focused thermal energy. The surrounding platform stones tell the same story. Blocks of basalt weighing up to 200 tons display smooth, glassy patches where the mineral structure has been altered at the molecular level. Petrographic analysis indicates that these surfaces were subjected to temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the threshold at which basalt begins to deform. The melting is shallow, rarely penetrating more than a fraction of an inch beneath the surface. Whatever generated the heat did not engulf the stone. It traced across it with surgical precision. No forge, kiln, or metallurgical technology known to have existed in the pre-Columbian Andes could have produced this effect. Tiahuanaco's builders worked primarily with copper and bronze, metals that melt at temperatures far below those required to vitrify basalt. Charcoal-fueled furnaces of the era could reach roughly 1,800 degrees under ideal conditions, still several hundred degrees short of the temperatures recorded on the stone surfaces. Lightning strikes were considered and ruled out because lightning leaves radial, chaotic scarring, whereas the marks at Tiahuanaco are linear, parallel, and repeated across multiple blocks with uniform depth. Some researchers have proposed that the lines are the result of natural weathering along grain boundaries in the stone, but this hypothesis fails to account for the vitrified residue found within the grooves. Weathering does not produce glass, only heat does. Others have suggested that the Tiahuanaco builders possessed a reflective solar technology capable of focusing sunlight into concentrated beams, but no mirrors, lenses, or parabolic reflectors have ever been recovered from the site, and the high-altitude cloud cover of the Altiplano would have made sustained solar concentration unreliable at best. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in the 16th century recorded local Aymara oral traditions, claiming that Tiahuanaco was built not by men, but by gods who could command fire from the sky. The Spanish dismissed the legends as superstition, and the melted stones remained unexplained. The lines still run straight across the basalt, precise as a laser and ancient as the mountain, and we are no closer to an answer than the day they were first examined. Top 5. The Çatalhöyük Glaze. In 1958, British archaeologist James Mellart discovered what would become one of the most important Neolithic sites ever unearthed. Çatalhöyük, located on the Konya Plain in south-central Turkey, was a settlement of roughly 8,000 people dating back to approximately 7,500 BCE, making it one of the oldest known proto-cities on Earth. The inhabitants lived in densely packed mud brick houses entered through holes in the roof, decorated their walls with painted murals of hunting scenes and geometric patterns, and buried their dead beneath the floors they slept on. It was a community frozen in the earliest chapter of human civilization, but something had happened to the walls that no chapter of known history could explain. Across multiple excavation layers, archaeologists found sections of mud brick wall that had been transformed. The outer surfaces had melted and resolidified into a thin, smooth, glass-like coating. The glaze was not decorative and was not painted on. It was the brick itself, fused at temperatures high enough to liquefy the silica content within the clay and convert it into a vitreous shell. In 2004, a materials science analysis conducted on samples from the site confirmed that the transformation required sustained heat of at least 1,250 degrees Fahrenheit. The study noted that the glaze was chemically identical to what would be produced in a modern industrial kiln operating at peak capacity. The problem is that no such kiln existed in 7500 BCE. The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük cooked over open hearths that reached at most 800 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit. They had no bellows, no forced air systems, and no enclosed combustion chambers capable of doubling or tripling ambient flame temperatures. Their most advanced thermal technology was the ability to fire simple clay figurines, a process requiring roughly half the heat needed to vitrify a mud brick wall. The gap between what they could produce and what the walls display is not a small margin of error. It is a technological chasm spanning nearly 800 degrees. The vitrification was not random. It appeared on specific wall sections in specific buildings, while adjacent structures remained untouched. This pattern eliminated wildfire as a cause, as a spreading blaze would not selectively glaze individual walls and leave neighboring rooms unscathed. Volcanic activity was also ruled out because the Konya Plains sits far from any active volcanic zone, and no tephra or lava deposits were found in the corresponding strata. Lightning remained a theoretical possibility, but the glazed surfaces were too uniform, too smooth, and too consistently distributed to match the erratic scarring pattern of an electrical discharge. Mellard himself never offered a definitive explanation for the phenomenon. Subsequent directors of the Çatalhöyük Research Project, including Ian Hodder of Stanford University, acknowledged the anomaly in published reports but focused excavation priorities elsewhere. The glazed walls were documented, photographed, sampled, and cataloged, and then the excavation moved on. 9,000 years ago, in one of the first cities ever built, someone or something subjected mud brick walls to temperatures that would not be reliably achieved by human technology for another 8 millennia. The glaze is still there, but the source of the heat is not. Top 6. The Hadassa Inferno. For nearly 5 centuries, Hadassa was the seat of an empire that made Egypt tremble. Perched on a rocky hillside in central Anatolia, roughly 95 miles east of modern Ankara, the Hittite capital sprawled across 440 acres of fortified terrain, ringed by walls over 3 miles long and built from stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons. Inside those walls stood more than 30 temples, a royal citadel, administrative archives containing 30,000 cuneiform tablets, and a population that rivaled any city in the ancient Near East. The Hittites fought Rameses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, and signed what is considered the earliest known international peace treaty. They were not a fragile civilization, they were a superpower. And around 1200 BCE, something erased them from the face of the earth. When archaeologists began systematic excavations in the early 20th century, they found a city that had been burned with extraordinary violence. Every timber structure had been consumed, and every mud brick wall had collapsed inward. But what stopped researchers was not the fire damage. It was the stone. Across the ruins, the exterior surfaces of limestone and basalt blocks had been vitrified, melted into a smooth, glassy coating that should not have been possible from ordinary combustion. The vitrification was not confined to a single building or a single district. It was spread across the entire city, from the great temple in the lower town to the royal palace on the high ridge of Bukale. The temperatures required to vitrify limestone begin at roughly 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, while basalt requires closer to 2,000. To melt the surfaces of stone buildings across a 440-acre urban footprint would require not just extreme heat but sustained, evenly distributed thermal energy on a scale that no ancient army could have delivered with torches, siege fires, or incendiary weapons. The Hittites themselves were among the most advanced metallurgists of the Bronze Age, pioneers of iron smelting whose furnaces reached temperatures higher than any of their contemporaries. Yet even Hittite technology could not have produced the heat necessary to glaze the walls of an entire capital. The identity of the attackers has never been established. The conventional narrative attributes the fall of Hattusa to the broader Late Bronze Age collapse, a cascading series of destructions around 1200 BCE that toppled civilizations from Greece to Mesopotamia. The Kaskian tribes from the north and the enigmatic Sea Peoples have both been named as suspects. However, recent excavation analysis suggests that Hattusa may have been gradually abandoned before the final burning, with the royal family and administrative elite withdrawing over a period of decades as drought and political fragmentation weakened the empire. If the city was already empty when it burned, then who set the fire? And more critically, what kind of fire melts stone across an area larger than 300 football fields? The cuneiform tablets survive because clay hardens in fire, and the stone walls survive because stone endures. But the surfaces of those walls tell a story the tablets never recorded. Something burned Hattusa at temperatures that the most advanced civilization of the Bronze Age could neither produce nor defend against. The empire vanished, but the glass remains. Top 7, the Pumapunku precision melt at 12,800 feet above sea level, on a windswept plateau in the Bolivian Andes, lies a field of shattered stone blocks that engineers still cannot fully explain. Pumapunku, a temple complex located less than half a mile from the ruins of Tiahuanaco, was constructed sometime between 500 and 900 CE by a civilization that left no written language, no technical manuals, and no record of how they accomplished what the stones make undeniably clear. They cut diorite with millimeter precision, and then something melted it. Diorite is among the hardest stones on Earth, ranking between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Harder than steel, harder than iron, and harder than any tool the pre-Columbian Andes is known to have produced. Modern quarries cut diorite with diamond-tipped saws and tungsten carbide drill bits, but the builders of Pumapunku had neither. Yet the blocks at the site display flat surfaces with tolerances so fine that adjacent faces fit together without any gap visible to the naked eye. Straight-edge cuts run for several feet without deviation, and internal angles meet at exactly 90 degrees. Interlocking H-shaped blocks repeat identical dimensions across dozens of specimens, as though stamped from a mold. But the cuts are not the mystery. The mystery is what happened at the edges. Along the cut surfaces of multiple diorite blocks, researchers have documented a thin, glassy residue consistent with localized thermal alteration. The stone at these points has not been chipped or ground. It has been melted. Petrographic examination indicates that the affected zones reach temperatures above 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the point at which diorite begins to lose structural integrity and its mineral components start to fuse. The melting does not extend deep into the stone. It appears only at the precise points where cuts were made, as though heat was applied as part of the cutting process itself, not as the result of accidental fire or natural disaster. No furnace, no forge, and no fuel source capable of reaching 2,200 degrees has been found anywhere at Pumapunku or in the surrounding Altiplano. At 12,800 feet, the atmospheric oxygen level is roughly 40% lower than at sea level, making sustained high-temperature combustion significantly more difficult. Charcoal fires at this altitude would struggle to exceed 1,400 degrees even under forced air conditions. The nearest timber forests lie dozens of miles away and thousands of feet below. Whatever produced the heat at the cut edges did so in one of the least hospitable environments on the continent for generating extreme temperatures. The Spanish chroniclers who first encountered Pumapunku in the 16th century recorded Aymara legends claiming the complex was built in a single night by beings who could soften stone with sound. The Spanish found the claim absurd, but modern engineers find the precision unsettling. The melted edges remain unexplained. Today, the blocks of Pumapunku lie scattered across the plateau like pieces of a puzzle No one has been allowed to reassemble. Some weigh over 130 tons, and most have been displaced by earthquakes, looting, and centuries of neglect. But the glassy residue at the cut lines is still there, still measurable, and still demanding an answer that neither archaeology nor geology has been able to provide. Top 8. The Sacsayhuaman Glaze. In 1553, Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de Leon stood before the walls of Sacsayhuaman and wrote that the stones were so tightly joined that the point of a pin could not be inserted between them. Nearly 5 centuries later, that observation still holds. The fortress sits on a steep hill overlooking Cusco, the former capital of the Inca Empire, at an altitude of 1,242 feet. Its 3 massive terrace walls zigzag across the hillside in 25 angles in 60 sections, built from limestone boulders so large that the biggest weighs an estimated 200 tons. No mortar was used, no cement, and no adhesive of any kind. The stones hold themselves together through geometry alone. But something else holds the attention of researchers who have examined the walls after dark. In the early 2000s, independent researchers Jan Peter de Jong and Christopher Jordan, working alongside Peruvian historian Jesus Gamarra, conducted a systematic survey of stone surfaces across multiple Inca sites in the Cusco region. Using handheld flashlights at night, they documented a phenomenon that had been noted but never formally studied. On dozens of blocks at Sacsayhuaman, the stone surface displayed a thin, glassy coating that refracted and diffracted light in a way that raw granite does not. The glaze was smooth, slightly translucent, and distinctly different in color from the underlying rock. Under magnification, the surface showed characteristics consistent with vitrification, the partial melting and resolidification of mineral content within the stone. The team documented identical glazing at Kenco, Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu, Pisac, and along the ancient stone-paved streets of central Cusco itself. The phenomenon was not confined to shaped blocks and walls. It appeared on exposed rock faces carved into mountainsides, on natural boulders within ceremonial complexes, and inside caves where no conventional fire could have sustained the temperatures required. According to their analysis, the vitrification demanded sustained heat of at least 2,012 degrees Fahrenheit. The Inca worked with bronze tools and charcoal furnaces, neither of which could approach that threshold. Conventional explanations have been attempted. Some geologists propose that the glaze was the result of natural weathering over centuries, with minerals polished by wind and rain into a reflective surface. However, weathering does not produce the light diffracting properties observed under flashlight testing. Weathered granite becomes rough and pitted. It does not develop a glassy skin. Others suggested that the Inca used an unknown plant extract capable of softening stone, a theory drawn from accounts by British explorer Percy Fawcett, who described a jungle plant whose sap could dissolve rock on contact. No such plant has ever been identified by modern botany. The Spanish dismantled much of Sacsayhuaman after their conquest, hauling stones down the hill to build colonial churches and mansions in Cusco. What remains today are only the lowest courses, the blocks too massive to move. Those blocks still carry the glaze. It still catches the light when the sun drops below the Andes and the surface cools in the mountain air. Whoever built these walls did not merely cut and stack stone. They altered its surface at a molecular level using a heat source that left no furnace, no fuel residue, and no explanation behind. The Inca had no word for the process, and modern science does not have one either. Top 9. The Baalbek Fusion. In the Bekaa Valley of eastern Lebanon, roughly 53 miles northeast of Beirut, stands a platform so massive that Roman engineers chose to build their largest temple directly on top of it rather than attempt to replicate it. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek, completed in the 1st century CE, was the most ambitious religious structure the Roman Empire ever erected. Its columns rose 65 feet, its courtyard spanned nearly 400 feet, and its grandeur was unmatched anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean. But the Romans did not build the foundation beneath it, and no one knows who did. The platform on which the temple rests is composed of stone blocks that dwarf anything the Romans ever quarried. 3 of them, known collectively as the Trilithon, weigh approximately 800 tons each. They sit side by side in the western retaining wall, raised more than 20 feet above ground level, and fitted together with a precision that leaves no visible gap between them. A fourth block, the stone of the pregnant woman, still lies partially buried in a nearby quarry, weighing an estimated 1,000 tons. A fifth, discovered in 2014 beneath it, weighs approximately 1,650 tons, making it the largest dressed stone block ever found on Earth. The engineering required to quarry, transport, and place these stones remains a subject of serious debate. But it is the surface condition of the trilithon blocks that has drawn a different kind of scrutiny. In 1984, German structural engineer Dieter Eckstein published an analysis of the limestone surfaces along the joints of the trilithon. He documented areas where the stone faces had undergone a process he described as thermal fusion. The surfaces were not simply weathered or polished, they had been bonded at a molecular level, with the calcium carbonate structure of the limestone partially melted and recrystallized across the contact zone between adjacent blocks. Limestone begins to calcine at around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit and melts completely near 2,500 degrees. However, Eckstein's analysis suggested that the fusion at Baalbek was not caused by temperature alone. The pattern of deformation indicated extreme compressive force applied simultaneously with heat, a combination consistent with high-energy shock events rather than sustained furnace exposure. He calculated that the pressure required to produce the observed fusion would exceed 50,000 pounds per square inch, a figure comparable to the overpressure generated by a low-altitude detonation. His findings were published in a German engineering journal, cited briefly in specialized literature, and never followed up by a major archaeological institution. The site has been continuously occupied and built upon for at least 9,000 years. Phoenician, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, and Ottoman structures all rest in layers above the original platform. Each civilization inherited the foundation, and none attempted to match it. Roman quarrying records, among the most detailed in the ancient world, make no mention of cutting or placing the trilithon. The blocks predate Roman occupation by an unknown margin. Lebanese authorities have restricted deep excavation beneath the platform for structural safety reasons. What lies under the trilithon has never been examined. The fused surfaces remain exposed to open air, visible but unstudied, carrying the signature of a force that no known civilization in the Bekaa Valley ever possessed and no known natural event has ever replicated. Top 10. The Rajasthan Ash Field. 10 miles west of Jodhpur, in the arid scrublands of Rajasthan, India, construction workers preparing the foundation for a new housing development in the early 2000s struck something unexpected beneath the topsoil. Spread across a 3-square-mile area lay a thick layer of ash so radioactive that Indian government officials ordered the site cordoned off and the project permanently halted. Birth defect rates and cancer incidence in surrounding villages had been abnormally high for as long as local health records existed. No one had investigated why until the excavation exposed what was underneath. Beneath the ash layer, ground-penetrating surveys revealed the outlines of an ancient urban settlement. Foundations, wall remnants, and structural footprints suggested a city of considerable size. But the condition of the remains was what silenced the excavation team. The walls and foundations were not crumbled or eroded. They were fused. Entire sections of mud brick and stone had melted together into solid vitrified masses, as though the city had been subjected to a single, catastrophic thermal event of extraordinary intensity. The fusion pattern radiated outward from a central zone, weakening with distance and forming the same thermal gradient documented half a continent away at Mohenjo-Daro. No volcanic activity has been recorded in the Jodhpur region within geological memory, and the nearest active seismic zone lies hundreds of miles to the north. Lightning does not produce radial vitrification patterns across 3 square miles. The ash itself presented an additional problem. Its radioactive signature was not consistent with any known natural mineral deposit in Rajasthan. Independent analysts noted that the isotopic profile bore closer resemblance to fallout residue than to geological radiation, though this finding has been disputed and no peer-reviewed confirmation has been published. The Indian government conducted nuclear weapons tests at Pokhran, roughly 130 miles to the southwest, in 1974 and again in 1998. Skeptics have pointed to these tests as a possible source of contamination, but the radioactive layer near Jodhpur was documented before the 1998 tests, and the 1974 detonation was an underground event whose fallout pattern does not match the concentration found at the site. The nearest nuclear power facility, Rawat, sits over 250 miles away. No plausible modern contamination pathway has been established that accounts for a 3-square-mile deposit of radioactive ash buried beneath centuries of sediment accumulation. The Mahabharata places the climactic battle of Kurukshetra in the broader region of what is now Rajasthan. The text describes a weapon called the Brahmastra that turned the land to desert, poisoned the water for generations, and caused survivors to lose their hair and nails within weeks. Hindu scholars have traditionally dated the events of the Mahabharata to approximately 3100 BCE. The ash field near Jodhpur has never been conclusively dated. Access to the site remains restricted, and no full-scale archaeological excavation has been conducted. No comprehensive radiological survey has been published in a major scientific journal. The housing development was never completed, and the workers who first uncovered the ash were relocated. The questions they unearthed were not. Beneath 10 miles of Indian desert, a city lies fused into glass, blanketed by ash that still registers on a Geiger counter, surrounded by villages where children are born with deformities no one can explain. The file remains open, the evidence remains buried, and the land still burns. 10 sites, 5 continents, and 9,000 years of human history, and in every case the same impossible signature. Stone melted by a heat source that should not have existed, could not have been produced by the technology of its era, and was never explained by the civilizations that inherited the ruins. This is not a collection of isolated anomalies. This is a pattern. From the vitrified streets of Mohenjo-Daro to the glassy ramparts of the Scottish Highlands, and from the fused limestone of Baalbek to the irradiated ash fields of Rajasthan, the evidence repeats itself with a consistency that resists coincidence. Someone or something generated temperatures between 1,650 and 3,300 degrees Fahrenheit at locations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, and in every instance, the source of that heat vanished without a trace. The response has been equally consistent. Sites were cordoned off, samples disappeared from archives, and excavations were halted, defunded, or redirected toward less uncomfortable questions. Researchers who published outside the accepted framework were dismissed, ignored, or simply never cited again. The pattern of suppression mirrors the pattern of destruction, systematic, thorough, and quietly efficient. Consider what has been lost. If even one of these sites preserves evidence of a thermal technology that predates recorded history, the implications reach far beyond archaeology. Energy production, materials science, and the very timeline of human capability would all require fundamental revision. The knowledge embedded in these melted stones could reshape how civilization understands its own past and its own potential. Instead, that knowledge remains locked in restricted excavation zones, classified sample archives, and academic silence. The melting did not stop because the heat source was exhausted. It stopped because someone stopped looking. Every fused wall, every vitrified rampart, and every sheet of desert glass is an unanswered question preserved in stone, waiting for the moment when the investigation is finally allowed to continue. The rocks remember what happened. The question is whether we will ever be permitted to listen. If these accounts of ancient glass and melted stone have changed the way you look at the ruins of our past, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the history that they have tried to keep hidden. Let us build a future of truth together. Our next investigation into the unknown will begin very soon.